Okay, we are live. Hello, everybody. Today we are reading what I think is potentially the last. Oh, something's happening to my computer. The timer I have going, I don't know, screwed things up. I'm doing laundry. We're reading, I think, the last conventionalism article that I have to read. Then after that, it may be on to writing. So this is On Becoming a Rooster, Zhuangzian, Conventionalism, and Survival of Death. The Zhuangzian depicts persons as surviving their deaths through the natural transformations of the world into very different forms, such as roosters, cartwheels, rat livers, and so on. It's common to interpret these passages metaphorically. In this essay, however, I suggest employing a conventionalist view of persons that says whether a person survives some event is not merely determined by the world, but is partly determined by our own attitudes. On this reading, Zhuang says, many teachings urging us to embrace transformation are not merely a psychological aid for dealing with death, but also serve as a tool for literally surviving it. In the Zhuangzi Chapter 6, The Great and Venerable Teacher, we encounter two stories of people who are thought to transform beyond their human form. The story is this: all at once, Master Yu fell ill. Master C wanted to see how he was. Amazing, said Master Yu. The Creator is making me all crookedly like this. My back sticks up like a hunchback. My vital organs are on top of me. My chin is hidden in my navel. My shoulders are up my head. If I pick up points at the sky, it must be some dislocation of the yin and yang. Yet he seemed calm and unconcerned. Dragging himself haltingly to the well, he looked at his reflection and said, my, so the Creator is making me all crookedly like this. Do you resent it? Asked Master Yu. Why no? What would I resent? If the process continues, perhaps in time I'll transform my left arm into a rooster. In that case, I'll keep watch during the night. Or perhaps in time he'll transform my right arm into a crossbow pellet, and I'll shoot down an owl for roasting. Or perhaps in time he'll transform my buttocks into cartwheels. Then, with my spirit for a horse, I'll climb up and go for a ride. What need will I ever have for carriage again? We all know that bodies undergo great transformation. Our body ages, eventually dies, then undergoes decomposition, leaving the molecules that made up the body to disperse and eventually become integrated via absorption, consumption, and so on with other plants and animals, such as roosters, or artifacts, such as cartwheels, and so on. However, part of what's striking about this passage is that Master Yu does not just take his molecules to take these new forms, but also he himself takes on those new forms. He does not merely say that if the left arm turned into a rooster, it would keep watch during the night. Rather, he is the first person pronoun I to indicate that he himself would be the rooster. The story of Master Yu is ambiguous whether we are to imagine his arm turning into a rooster while Master Yu is alive in his human form, or only after he has died, but the story immediately following strongly indicates that, at least in part, what is in mind is transformation after one's death. Suddenly, Master Lai grew ill. Gasping and wheezing, he lay at the point of death. His wife and children gathered round in a circle and began to cry. Master Li, who had come to ask how he was, said, Shoo, get back, don't disturb the process of change. Then he leaned against the doorway and talked to Master Lai. How marvelous the Creator is. What is he going to make out of you next? Where is he going to send you? Will he make you into a rat's liver? Will he make you into a bug's arm? Clearly, the transformation into a rat's liver or bug's arm is conceived as happening after Master Lai's death. The stories of Master Yu and Lai taken together indicate that people can continue to exist beyond their own death in a naturalistic sort of way. Such survival doesn't require the existence of a supernatural realm that we go to after death, nor does it require the existence of some immaterial soul that can be reincarnated in different forms. Rather, the Zhuangzi treats their survival as consisting in the continued existence on Earth as one or more mirrored things, such as roosters, cartwheels, bug arms, and so on. This view also seems to imply that one can exist as a scattered object, even though the molecules of one's decomposed body scatter in different directions. The text seems to suggest that the scattered molecules would still be parts of Master Yu. Thus, if Master Yu simultaneously has both a rooster and especially disconnected crossbow pellet as parts, he could simultaneously keep watch during the night and shoot down to hell for roasting. One might think the idea is absurd, for Master Yu cannot be two different objects, but the claim here is not that he would be two objects, but only that he would be one with at least two spatially disconnected parts. This view is highly counterintuitive. We ordinarily think that we cease to exist at death. Even if our corpse were to turn into a rooster, that rooster would not be oneself. We might make the story more believable if we assume that Zhuangzi is saying that where Master Yu's body turned into a rooster, the rooster would not have any of Master Yu's memories or personality, but would just have the psychology of a normal rooster. Nevertheless, it would still be counterintuitive to hold that Master Yu himself would be the rooster. For this reason, it's not surprising that many scholars interpret the stories metaphorically, denying that the Zhuangzi intends anything about the survivor of death. For instance, Zhang H. Li says, Ziyu, Master Yu, will not enjoy another life as the rooster or owl, and he further claims that ultimately Zhuangzi suggests that the transcendence of the fear of death can only commence with the recognition that one's personal identity eventually expires, a notion unthinkable for many ancient Chinese as part of the transformation of the Tao. Louis Kamjathi, likewise, says the passage seems to indicate that death is the dissolution of the self, separation of the various elements of personhood. There's no post-mortem existence, no personal survivor after death. Kim Chong Chong, referring to stories of Master Yu and Lai, says that Junzi's definition of hua, or transformation, opposes the way that Zhuangzi used the term. According to Zhuangzi, something may be said to have been transformed only when it was one and the same entity as undergone the process of change. Thus, Chang is assuming that in Master Yu's story, it would not be one and the same entity that is human at one time and Rooster at the other. Notice that I'm not claiming that Chang accepts Junzi's definition, and the quote, however, Chang indicates that Junzi's definition conflicts with the way Zhuangzi uses the term hua. My claim is that Chang, that's the cat, would not think that such a conflict arises if he interpreted Zhuangzi as holding that it's the same entity as the one that's at one time a human and at the other time a rooster. Okay, cat, what do you want? Wait, what do you want? Where are you going? So I want to look up these three articles: Li, Kamjathi, and Chang. Li, what's it like to be a butterfly, or the foundations of religion, and then Taoist tradition, Zhuangzian, and Chang, Zhuangzi's critique of Confucianism. So most of them are books. Mark Brookson, they keep going. Mark Brookson also denies that there's a self that persists through change, instead holding that there's simply an ongoing series of transformation. Jogan Liu takes Master Liu's hypothesizing as mere imagination, taking the story to not have any implications concerning our ability to survive death. No matter how depressing Master Liu's health may be, you can always shift it to a positive or an optimistic mode through curiosity and imagination. What the author wants to express is clear. By learning how to keep your mind and mood at ease through adversity, people can mount a springboard from which to jump into the sphere of spiritual freedom. Others likewise shy away from drawing conclusions about our ability to survive. Mercedes Bamisa says the key teaching in the story is that however big the changes, even if they involve terminal disease, we should not fear or hate them, but adapt to them and see in them a window of opportunity. Mary Buckover says that least might consider possibilities. I think the point is this: life is unpredictable and can do anything. The question is, what will we make of it? Will we live virtuously, or the best we can, despite what life may throw at us? So we have Berkson, Liu, Valmisa, and Buckover. Berkson, Liu, Buckover, and Valmisa. Okay, chapters and stuff mostly. In this essay, I'll go against the trend and instead suggest that Zhuangzian is literally holding that we can survive our death in the above division ways. In order to provide a framework for doing so and lend credibility to such a reading, I will draw from recent work in metaphysics that holds that persons are in some sense conventional. On this view, whether we survive an event at least sometimes is not only determined by the world, but is at least partly determined by attitudes. In particular, I suggest reading Zhuangzi is holding a sort of conventionalism that's both extreme and nuanced. It's extreme because it holds that by undergoing a freeing of the bound, one's attitudes are changed in such a way that one literally survives death and undergoing various transformations of the body. And it's nuanced because only one aspect of oneself, Zhuangzi calls the Wu self, can survive death in this way. In section 2, I further explicate this conventionalism about personal identity. In sections 3 and 4, I explain and defend the conventionalist view that I attribute to Zhuangzi. Finally, I draw out the connections between this conventionalist reading and other passages in Zhuangzi and section 5. Personal identity and conventionalism. Common sense tells us we persist over time. I not only exist today, but I also existed yesterday and a year ago, much farther back, to when I was just a wee baby. This implies that there are changes that I can survive. I survived from the change from being a baby to being an adult. However, common sense also tells us there's events we do not survive, such as being burnt to a crisp and having one's ashes dispersed across the universe. This common sense intuition may seem in tension with the sort of conventionalism that I attribute to Zhuangzi, on which we can exist as scattered remains of our body. However, we can address this apparent conflict by pointing out that our intuition is indeed true of ordinary cases. People don't normally have the sort of attitude that allows them to survive such a transformation. We can say that common sense is correct about normal circumstances. We just should not try to extend it to say that it's impossible to alter one's attitudes in the way that allows one to survive in such a way. What criteria of personal identity accounts for the fact that I can survive some kinds of changes but not others? That is, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for a person at one time being identical to an entity? Here I take the term entity to apply to any sort of object, persons, non-persons, wholes and parts, and wholes alike. At another time, reflection on this question is about philosophers' two main candidate answers. The first is psychological criterion. For instance, John Locke's point, to memory, thus he profit from a more sophisticated view. Thus, since I'm psychologically continuous in the right way, such as via memory with the baby that lived some years ago, I'm identical to the baby. Likewise, I'm not psychologically connected in the right way to the dispersed remains of my bare body. For instance, it does not have my memories. I would not be identical to such a dispersed object. The second candidate answer is the physical criterion, see especially Olson. On this view, one could say the baby is the same biological organism as me, and therefore identical to me, but this collection of dispersed ashes is not, since it's not a mere biological organism, so it's not identical to me. To see more clearly that these are two different answers, rather than the same answer stated in two different ways, consider teletransportation, much like the found in the Western TV show Star Trek. Suppose the process works like this, follows, you step into a blah, 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 blah. I don't need to read it. The fact that there seems to be no way to settle the debate has led to many to the conventionalist conclusion that the issue in part depends on one's person's directed attitudes. Conventionalists differ on which particular attitudes are relevant for determining one's survival conditions. For instance, Mark Johnston emphasizes attitudes such as anticipation. David Markovacs takes it to be one's belief. David Brad Mitchell and Miller include attitudes concerning responsibility and property ownership. I'm wondering whether I should put that distinction into Hypernomicon, which attitudes, which conventions matter. I don't think so, because everybody's got different conventions, basically, and I just have a separate entry for all of them. To illustrate, consider two communities. Those in the somatophile community believe they don't survive teletransportation and have a corresponding person-directed attitudes. They fear teletransportation to death. They don't anticipate the experiences of the duplicate as being their own experiences, and so forth. Those in the teletransporting community, on the other hand, believe they survive and have a corresponding person-directed attitudes. They freely embrace teletransportation, treating it merely as a form of convenient high-speed travel. They likewise anticipate the experiences of the duplicates as being their own experiences, and so on. Conventionalists hold that it's intuitive that, I'm going to keep reading and go back to the footnote later, that neither community can be said to be wrong or mistaken. Rather, each community is correct in their own terms. The somatophiles do not survive teletransportation, while the teletransporters do. First, some such as Johnson, Kovacs bases situation on the pre-commitment to a permissive ontology, such as its form of four-dimensionalism, on which coinciding with each person, or in each person, there's both an object that survives teletransportation and an object that does not. If the plausibility of conventionalism rests on such an ontology, it makes it less likely that Zhuangzian is a conventionalist. However, many other conventionalists think the view is plausible even without an antecedent commitment to such a permissive ontology. See, for instance, Miller, also White and Brad Mitchell and West make no appeal to such an ontology to motivate conventionalism. And then footnote 9, notice this is not the claim that communities' ways of life are equally beneficial. The psychological community does have the advantage of high-speed travel. Conventionalists point to the difference in person-directed attitudes as accounting for the difference in survival conditions between the two communities. This is what Mark Johnston calls the radical reversal. Roughly put, we ordinarily think that whether or not we survive an event should determine whether or not we should fear it as death. But on conventionalism, matters are reversed. Whether or not we fear a process of death determines whether or not we survive that process. Here I should make one important clarification. Conventionalism does not claim that our attitudes can determine the physical facts, rather it just claims that our attitudes can determine the identity facts. For example, in the above teletransportation situation, the physical facts include the fact that you were disintegrated by the initial teletransportation machine on Earth, that the receiving machine on the Moon makes physical and psychological duplicate of you out of your items that were not originally part of the initial machine. Conventionalism does not claim that your attitudes can affect those physical facts. For instance, it doesn't claim that your attitudes can determine whether or not the duplication will succeed if the device on the Moon were to fail, instead making, say, a person with different psychological features from you, or even just producing a facial flower, or failing to produce anything at all. This is just a fault of the machinery rather than your attitudes. On the other hand, supposing that the teletransportation were to successfully make a duplicate of you on the Moon, conventionalism does claim that your attitudes determine whether or not that duplicate on the Moon is you. So the identity facts that conventionalism claims are under control of our attitudes, not the physical facts. I propose reading Zhuangzian as a conventionalist. To begin to see why I think the conventionalist view fits well with Zhuangzian's tendency to take distinctions and divisions not as objective facts to be found in the world, but rather as originating from the mind. This is the first historical person going into Hypernomicon, I think. And the question is how to do it. I'm inclined to make a debate space for historical philosophers and a debate for each philosopher, and then positions under the philosopher describing their views And in the positions are the claims for which we think they have those views, including arguments. I like that. History. Now, under history, whoops. We need Zhuangzian. Okay, and then their works can be key works in this debate. So, if I just put the positions in, like, blah, 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 I won't have any way to easily tell which are ostensibly true or false, sort of, from my point of view. But that's just a general problem about Hypernomicon. That's not special history, so I will accept it. Okay, and now the arguments. I think the conventionalist view, for instance, in chapter 2, discussing all things making equal, Longenecker says everything has its that, everything has its this. From the point of view of that, you cannot see it, but through understanding, you can know it. So I say that comes out of this, and this depends on that, which is to say that this and that give birth to each other. Therefore, the sage recognizes a this, but a this that is also a that, and the that is also a this. His that is both a right and a wrong in it, has both a right and a wrong in it. His this, too, has both a right and a wrong in it. Notice the distinction between she and fei, right and wrong, here includes many layers of meaning. It's a distinction between what exists and what does not exist, what's correct and incorrect, and also a distinction between what's good and bad. Oh, sorry, I wasn't really reading. She is this. The fei is just wrong. The Zhuangzian is thus pointing out that the sage does not make actual distinctions between such kinds of she and fei because there's no such actual distinctions to be found in the world. That's why Zhuangzian says if discriminations are put into words, they do not suffice, and those who discriminate fail to see. Likewise, Zhuangzian emphasizes the fact that such boundaries originate in the mind. The way has never known boundaries, speech is no constancy, because the recognition of this, the she, there came to be boundaries. Instead, Zhuangzian admonishes us to give up distinctions altogether. Right is not right, so it is not so. If right were really right, it would clearly differ from not right, that there would be no need for argument. If so were really so, it would differ so clearly from not so that there would be no need for argument. Forget the years, forget distinctions. Leap into the boundless and make it your home. Likewise, many commentators explicitly take this Zhuangzi to hold the distinctions to be mind-made. For instance, Chen Yan writes, things themselves do not have shi-fei, bi-chi distinctions, only when things are brought into relation with people on the basis of their epistemic perspective and examination do such shi-fei, bi-chi distinctions exist. Guangming Wu comments the object self is obtrusive in that, as Kant says, it has its experience only by imposing its synthetic a priori forms on reality on the thing in itself. The Wool self originates division, a subjective regarding of the object is different from the self. I don't know what obtrusive means in this context, although I guess it just means what it goes on to say. There's a strong emphasis in Zhuangzian on the mind dependence and divisions and distinctions. For this reason, I do not think it would be surprising at all to find that the Zhuangzian holds a similar attitude concerning the divisions involved in personal identity, specifically boundaries demarcating when one exists and when that same entity ceases to exist. In fact, I think the Master's You and Lie passages quoted at the outset of this essay indicate that Zhuangzi does indeed apply the mind dependence of divisions to personal identity. From those passages, we see Zhuangzi revising those divisions. To be clear, I'm not claiming that Zhuangzi thinks our attitudes can determine physical facts. That Master Yu's body at one point stops all its functioning, that his body eventually decays in the ground, that his body's molecules that become integrated, say, into a rooster, a cartwheel, a river, are all facts that are determined by the world rather than one's mind or attitudes. However, I don't think that for the Zhuangzian, I do think for the Zhuangzian, the world itself doesn't determine where in that process lies the border that marks the point at which Master Yu ceases to exist. Instead, such an identity fact originates from our minds. That is why Master Yu can continue to exist even after his body is decayed and its composite molecules have dispersed. Ordinary people, because their attitudes cease to exist at death, that is, they cease to exist once their biological and psychological functions have stopped, but because personal identity facts are mind-dependent, Master Yu is able to revise or even do away with such divisions and survive his death. I propose reading Zhuangzian as a sort of conventionalist, but we see that Zhuangzian is I don't know. I think this is still continuing the argument, but this is shifting enough, I think, that I want to get this argument in. There are two spaces here. The position has a space at the beginning. I will fix that. So first I fix the position by removing the space, and now back to the argument. I don't know why I'm keeping these weird quotation marks in Hypernomica. I should just be deleting them and putting in proper ones, but what can I say? Fly like that. This is tedious. Beautiful. Wonder what this Watson thing is. Burton Watson, the complete works of Zhuangzian. Okay, that's enough. I propose what are radical attitudes? Master Yu tells us. I received life because of the time had come. I will lose it because the order of things passes on. But content with it. Be content with this time and dwell in this order, and then neither sorrow nor joy can touch you. In ancient times, this was called the fraying of the bound. I take this attitude that is free of the bound, Zhuangzian also appears at the end of chapter 3, The Secret of Caring for Life. To be further elucidated in various other passages, though if one disagrees with me on this point, one may use a different umbrella term to rank them. For instance, Master C, Master U, Master Li, Master Lao were all four talking together. Who can look on non-being as his head, on life as his back, and on death as his rump, they said. Who knows that life and death, existence and annihilation are all a single body? I will be his friend. The four men looked at one another and smiled. There was no disagreement in their hearts, and so the four of them became friends. Where most people look upon death as the end of their existence, these friends take it instead as part of their existence. Also from the passages quoted at the very beginning of the essay, we know that the four friends not only see the particular moment of death that is part of their existence, but also the subsequent transformations that the corpse undergoes. Further elucidating this unbound attitude, Master Lai explains when a skilled smith is casting metal, if the metal should leap up and say, I insist on being made into a moya, he would likely regard it as an inauspicious metal indeed. Now, having had the audacity to take on human form once, if I should say I don't want to be anything but a man, nothing but a man, the Creator would surely regard me as a most inauspicious sort of person. So now I think of heaven and earth as great furnace, and the Creator is a skilled smith. Where should he send me? That would not be all right. In sum, Master U, Master Lai have an unbound attitude characterized by taking death and the resulting transformations as part of their existence, embracing whatever changes will occur to them, even disfiguration of death, not demanding that they remain in human form, but being all right with whatever new forms they encounter. Let's put this unbound attitude in as another argument. Somebody asked, the Saito architect asked, why are you in India? I live here. I'm a professor of philosophy at Ashoka University. It's a small liberal arts college in Haryana, India, which is north of Delhi. And I mean, it's the summer, so in principle I could be anywhere, but I'm here. I don't want to travel during coronavirus. I don't want to leave the cats behind, and where would I really go anyways? So we're just gonna copy and paste some of these things. The evidence for this is that it's called being free of the bound. So this is a nice quote. And we're not gonna. I said we're not gonna fix the quotation marks, but we're gonna fix them. Okay, that's good enough for this argument. You sound American. Yeah, I don't know. Sorry, I don't know if that response was before or after I answered, but I am American. I'm from California. The unbound attitude is echoed and praised in other parts of the Zhuangzi as well. We are told that the sage delights in early death, he delights in old age, he delights in the beginning, he delights in the end. Furthermore, the true man of ancient times knew nothing of loving life, knew nothing of hating death. He emerged without delight, he went back in without a fuss, he came briskly, he went briskly, and that was all. He didn't forget where he began, he didn't try to figure out where he would end. He received something and took pleasure in it, he forgot about it and handed it back. This sounds like something from Hesiod, if I recall correctly. In chapter 5, the sign of virtue complete, the Zhuangzi illustrates this attitude through Wang Tai, an ex-convict who had his leg chopped off, explaining life and death are great affairs, and yet there are no change to Wang Tai. Though heaven and earth flop over and fall down, it's no loss to him. As for things, he sees them as one and does not see their loss. He regards the loss of a foot as a lump of earth thrown away. I suggest interpreting this Zhuangzi as holding that in having an unbound attitude that embraces the transformations that one's body undergoes, one can survive death and the endless transformations after. Yeah, I think that's clear enough that I'm not going to bother putting it in to here, but I notice now I made a typo. What if all philosophy was written by pathologically confused people? Would that cheapen the field as a whole? No, because everybody's pathologically confused about everything, so nothing special about philosophy. I suggest interpreting the Zhuangzi as holding that and having an unbound attitude that embraces the transformations that one's body undergoes, one can survive death and the endless transformations thereafter. In other words, much as conventionalists typically think the members of the teletransporter community survive teletransportation since they neither fear it nor try to avoid it, but rather embrace it and view their duplicate as a continuation of their existence, as Zhuangzi holds that those who are free from the bound survive death and subsequent endless transformations, since they neither fear nor try to avoid those transformations, but rather embrace them and see them as a continuation of their own existence. Great. Everyone? Yeah, well, so that was a bit of a glib answer. So, like, pathologically confused. Like, what do you mean by, like, pathologically? Like, we use that word to describe people who need, like, treatment by doctors or something. Nobody who's confused needs treatment by a doctor. Like, at best, you need to see a therapist or something. But, like, everybody could go in for some therapy. It never hurts. So, like, everybody's confused about stuff. Nobody's got it all figured out. And certainly philosophers are no exception in one direction or another. I've already mentioned that Zhuangzi goes beyond standard forms of criticism by holding a radical version of it. But another way in which Zhuangzi's conventionalism is unique is in holding that to be different. There to be different kinds of selves, not all of which can survive death. In chapter 2, Zichi of Southwall claims that I have lost myself. That both Wu and Wo. Okay, so I don't speak Chinese, so I'm not sure exactly. Though both Wu and Wo are first-person pronouns, Zhuangzi here is treating them as referring to different selves. There are also other first-person pronouns used throughout the Zhuangzi, but they seem closely interconnected with Wu and Wo. For instance, in claiming that the sage is no self, Ji is closely tied to Wo, which one can lose. In chapter 5, Wu is closely synonymous with Yu. In chapter 7, Lizi, a follower of Huizi, becomes convinced that the teachings of the shaman Zhuangzian are greater than Huizi's own. On hearing Lizi's intoxication with the shaman, Huizi replies, I've already showed you all the outward forms. I haven't showed you the substance. Try bringing your shaman along next time and letting him get a look at me, Yushi. The shaman thus comes to visit Huizi on a number of occasions, and each time Huizi explains to Lizi what Huizi had shown of himself to the shaman using the term wuxi in each such explanation. So, sorry, that links Wu with Yu because he says Yushi and then he shows him wuxi. Got it. Do you think Jesus had it all figured out? No, clearly not. One of the main differences between the Wu self and the Wo self worth pointing out is their connection to social roles. Duan Yukai, the commentator of the authoritative Chinese dictionary in the Han Dynasty explaining graphs and analyzing characters, explains when one is talking about oneself amongst others, the appropriate word for self-reference is Wo. In contrast, Wu was to be used in one's private thoughts when one thinks about oneself. For this reason, Thomas Ming takes the Wu self to be a private self and the Wo self to be a social self. Chen Jing similarly takes the passage to be a reaction to the Confucian view that persons are defined in terms of the role they play in the web of relationships, such as the ruler-subject, father-son, husband-wife relationship. Chen explains that for Zhuangzi, the Wo self corresponds to the Confucian self that's defined by the roles, but that the Wo self, in being so defined, loses its naturalness in carrying the burden of having to fulfill those roles. Consequently, being so characterized by artificiality, the Wo self is unable to achieve Yu, for which Zhuangzi is the highest state of freedom. On the other hand, the Wu self can extricate itself from the constraining roles of the Wo self and draw closer to the state of Yu. Cool. Given the above characterizations of the Wu and the Wo self, the conventionalist interpretation of Zhuangzi should hold that the Wu self, not the Wo self, is able to survive death. One reason for this is it's impossible to fulfill societal roles, such as being a good parent to one's child, or a good ruler to someone's subject if one were a corpse or a Rooster or a wheel cart. So yeah, I guess this Wo self is like the Confucian self, not like the thing that the Confucians take to be the self. I always think that the Wo self is the socially constructed self, and the Wu self is a deeper thing. But no, the Wo self is literally the Confucian self, and so that thing dies. So given the Wo self is defined by the social roles and death prevents the Wo self's fulfillment of the roles, death thereby brings about the destruction of the Wo self. On the other hand, since the Wu self is not so characterized this way, this leaves open the possibility that exists when it's unable to fulfill such roles. Similarly, we've already seen Guangming Wu's claim that the Wo self originates division. A subjective regarding of the others is different from the self. Tied in with the conventionalist reading, the idea is then that the Wo self is the one that has the bound attitude that takes death as marking the boundary between existence and non-existence. However, lives in Wo self, the Wu self can broaden or completely do away with all such boundaries between itself and what comes before and after it. In this way, the Wu self can It's wrapped up. Interesting. So we're going to nest this under conventionalism. That was a mistake. Okay, so let's get these Chinese characteristics in here. Good. I don't think we'll put woe and woo self into the glossary because, I don't know. I take it back. Immediately as I said that, I changed my mind. I think, like on Wikipedia, there's the two camps, the people who say let's put everything in Wikipedia and the people who say, let's put only important stuff or whatever in there. And I would clearly be in the first group, put everything in there. Okay. Similarly, we have already seen Corman Wu's claim that the woe self originates division for subjective regarding of the other. Maybe let's actually put that argument in there. I mean, not that argument, that point. Maybe. Yeah, why not? Cool. Clarifications and objections. Let me now make some clarifications about my reading and address some objections. One might object that the use of humor in the stories of Master Yu and Lai indicate that Zhuangzian doesn't intend the stories to be taken literally. For instance, Master Yu speaking of his buttocks turning into wheels, or imagining Master Lai becoming a rat liver, may seem like playful examples not to be taken seriously. In response, I take the examples not as telling against the literal translation, but instead as expressions of an unbound attitude that welcomes death with playful ease and even giddy delight, for only those with a bound attitude think death is something to be talked about solemnly and seriously. Furthermore, since those who are unbound welcome all the transformations they face, they likewise do not insist on becoming transformed into something no more respectable, but delight even in becoming something as humble as a rat's liver. I'll put that in there. That's an argument we can go back and forth about. We are just going to copy and paste his entire response because it's very straightforward and short, and I don't have enough context to know if it's good or not, but I am inclined to think it's good. A separate issue concerns what Zhuangzian thinks surviving as a rat liver or cartwheel is like. Do such things even have conscious experiences? That is Zhuangzian sort of panpsychist? Some, such as Brian Hoffer, Eric Schwartzgable, and Jenny Hung, think so. Hoffer, Schwartzgable, and Hung. Hoffer, Hung. Okay. If you insist. One passage in support of this claim is the story of Lady Li, who wept when she was kidnapped but regretted her tears when she discovered her new life was better than her former one. The text then asks, how do I know that the dead do not wonder why they ever long for life? Another passage is taken from Master Lai's deathbed monologue. The great Claude burdens me with form, labors me with life, eases me in old age, and rests me in death. I will go off to sleep peacefully, and then with a start I'll wake up. Though these might suggest a panpsychist reading, I think one can reasonably resist such a reading. The Lady Li passage does not itself commit to the idea that the dead are able to have such emotions such as regret. Rather, the passage only raises it as a conceptual possibility. Furthermore, one might take the moral of the story simply to be this: the state of the dead, even if it doesn't involve conscious experience, could be better than the state of being alive. Such a moral doesn't require panpsychism. As for Master Lai's deathbed monologue, even if we deny a panpsychist reading, we can still All that one can regain consciousness after death by becoming conscious beings such as a rooster or a horse, or even just some part of their brain. Thus, in saying with the start, I'll wake up, Masterfly might be referring to such phases of the process of transformation. I think one can plausibly hold it on panpsychist reading. Nevertheless, both panpsychist and non-panpsychist views are compatible with conventions reading of the Zhuangzian. So, since they're both compatible with conventionalism, I don't know. I don't know. There's 3 people going for this panpsychist thing, which suggests it's a big enough deal to stick in Typonomicon. It's not relevant for the direct thing we're talking about, but like, whatever. Yeah. So this is just a new thing. This is just a new position, and it's called Rooster is a panpsychist, and this is good to go. And we make a new argument. And we're just going to copy and paste Longenecker's quick summary of this thing because it's pretty good. Does anyone know if Eric Schwitzgable speaks Chinese? And we're not going to copy and paste for this, we're just going to summarize. Properly speaking, I have no view on this topic, but just from what I've read here, I'm inclined to go with Longenecker. One might object that this extreme sort of conventionalism that I attribute to Zhuangzian is philosophically untenable. For example, Mark Johnson argues that one cannot transform into a non-person because non-persons don't have interest. As he said, only persons have interest in the relevant sense, and the sense of interest at hand, the sense that is relevant to identifying with some person as my future self. Only persons, that is, reflective, intelligent beings that can consider themselves at various places and times, have interests. The relevant dispositions cannot get purchased on spiders, rainforests, crystals, or the like. In other words, since one can only identify with something that has real interest, and only persons have such interest, it follows that one could not identify with non-persons. Therefore, if surviving as something requires identifying with them, one cannot survive as a non-person. However, I believe Zhuangzian would deny premise A, holding it to be a form of bounded bound thinking. Why not bounded? Just as Zhuangzi takes someone who says, I don't want to be anything but a man, nothing but a man, to be the most inauspicious sort of person, so Zhuangzi would hold the attraction of A as deriving from our desire to be something with real interest, not a thing but something with real interest. This deep-seated desire to cling to our status as reflective, intelligent beings that have interest makes us averse to identifying with spiders, cartwheels, or rat livers, and it's easy to mistake this as overwhelming desire as an indication that such an identification is impossible. However, I take the Zhuangzi instead to be suggesting that contrary to A, we can indeed identify with such non-persons by unbinding ourselves from a narrow-minded unwillingness to let go of the familiar. That's good. Let's put that in there. And then the reply. Very good. Whoops. Very good. Another objection one might have with my reading is that it's incompatible with Zhuangzi's other teachings concerning the self. For instance, after Zhuangzi's wife died, Zhuangzi said, I look back to her beginning and the time before she had a spirit. In the midst of the jumble of wonder and mystery, a change took place and she had a spirit. Another change and she had a body. Another change and she was born. Now there's been another change and she's dead. It's just like the progression of the four seasons, spring, summer, fall, winter. There are two different kinds of objection one might raise to the conventionalist reading in connection with this passage. The first objection is this. Here Zhuangzi indicates that just as a change in ceases is inevitable or occurs regardless of one's attitudes, so the changes that occur to one's body, including death, are inevitable and occur regardless of our attitudes. One might think this is intentional with conventionalist view. However, this objection only arises when one overlooks the distinction between physical and identity effects. The conventionalists can agree that the physical changes that happen to oneself often happen regardless of one's attitudes, since conventionalists just claim that our attitudes determine the identity facts. In other words, Zhuangzi doesn't need to know anything about his wife's attitudes to know whether or not she's died. If she has not taken a breath and her heart has not beaten for over a week, she's indeed dead. No need to consult her attitudes, but whether she still exists as the dead corpse or as a number of other things does require an understanding of her attitudes. Clearly correct, so correct, not even worth putting into Hypernomicon. A second objection that might arise in connection with this passage is more subtle. The objection says if Zhuangzi truly is a conventionalist, then we should expect Zhuangzi here to mention that his wife existed prior to her acquiring a body and or that she continued to exist after she died, yet Zhuangzi doesn't mention either of these things. I don't know if that's more subtle. I guess, because this was like stupid. The Watson's translation says a change took place and she had a spirit, another change and she had a body, thus suggesting that she existed prior to birth. The original Chinese doesn't employ the pronoun she. Bian Yu Qi Bian Yu Jing. Although had Zhuangzi used the term Hua here, that might have indicated that Zhuangzi takes it to be the same entity that persists through all the changes. That at least is how Zhenzhe in his rectifying names understands the term, something which has its form changed but reality is the same. This is called Hua. The word Bian, however, is the term Zhuangzi actually uses, which might not seem to have this implication. In response, we should recognize that this story belongs to the outer chapters, so we should be extra hesitant in assuming it was penned by the same author that penned the stories of Masters Yu and Lai. Don't know what the outer chapters are. Nevertheless, even if we make the assumption there are a couple of possible responses we can make, one is to hold that even if Zhuangzian didn't believe his wife survived death, this is only because he realized she didn't have the right attitude, so Zhuangzian had to cope with her death in a different way. Alternatively, we can read the passage not as denying that his wife survived death, but as preventing Zhuangzian's own self-treatment of his bound attitude towards her death. Zhuangzian realized that in mourning her death, he himself was clinging to her human form. The way to treat and avoid such clinging is not through the reminder that his wife survived, but is primarily carried out through the recognition that the naturalness of the endless changes of the world. In other words, though recognizing that she survived could help treat Zhuangzian's grief, Zhuangzian here is recognizing that the fundamental problem is not his grief, but his bound attitude, a problem that requires a very different kind of treatment. Yeah, I mean, this is all pretty straightforward, I think. No need to put that in. To understand my conventionalist reading of the Zhuangzian, let me compare it to A.C. Graham's. Liberation from selfhood is seen above all triumph over death. Zhuangzian's position is not that personal consciousness will survive death, rather than grasping the way. One's viewpoint shifts from I shall no longer resist to something like losing selfhood, I shall remain what at the bottom I've always been, identical with the endlessly transforming phenomena of the universe. That sounds like the Buddhist view. I assume that by losing selfhood, Graham does not mean to say that, well, look, let's just highlight. I assume that by losing selfhood, Graham does not mean to say that one ceases to exist, but only has in mind the attitude of not clinging to a particular form or state, such as having a healthy, disfigured body or being human. Look, it's even saying clinging. Though if he instead means that one ceases to exist, or that there's no self to begin with, then the view is obviously quite different from my own. Given the assumption, Graham interprets Zhuangzian saying that in death one continues to exist as all the endlessly transforming phenomena of the universe. This is quite different from my own conventionalist interpretation, since mine does not imply that one is necessarily identical with all the transformations of the universe, but might only be identical with some of those transformations. My interpretation allows for this possibility since people can have different attitudes. Even if one embraces death as part of their existence, it's still up to them whether they'll identify with transformations of the entire universe, since all the 10,000 things are wrong with me, or just the identification of, or just identifying the transforming a particular part of it. So this sounds Hindu, sort of a Vedanta. It's the distinction between sort of enlightenment, realizing the Atman is the Brahman, and failing to achieve samsara. I take this feature of the account to have a textual backing. Master Yu only identifies with the transformation that his body undergoes, such as left arm turning into a rooster or right arm turning into a crossbow pellet, or rather than all transformations of the entire universe. Master likewise is not thought of as transforming into a whole bug, but just its arm, nor is he thought of as transforming into an entire rat, but just its liver. I found a point of clarity. Do I put this in? No, is it? Well, what's this A.C. Graham thing? Let's see. Disputers of the Tao, philosophical arguments in ancient China. Let's put it in, just because it seems rich in getting us to Hinduism and Buddhism. Well, what is the view? You're identical with the endlessly transforming phenomena of the universe. Yeah, so it's not the no self view. Okay, that's good. Final point of contention about my account is that I do not intend to claim that survival of death is the primary or only goal for Zhuangzian, and what one who takes a conventionalist interpretation of Zhuangzian can still agree that Zhuangzian has other aims as well. For instance, as Zhuangzian explains, for Zhuangzian, the ordinary person's sorrow, the ordinary person's fatigue, the ordinary person's confusion, these problems are where Zhuangzian's concern lies. Kwang Wu says to live rightly is neither living redemptively nor living enlightenedly, but living appropriately, that is, fitting to the changing climate of things, now soaring, now roaming, and that is Zhuangzi's central concern. Similarly, Bai Rufeng argues that for Zhuangzi, the heart-mind's highest realm is the pure and simple kind of free and natural state, one that should not have a differentiation of merit points, nor the excessive miscellany of nobility and lowliness. The conventionalist reading of Zhuangzi is compatible with holding that Zhuangzi takes such a free and natural state to be the highest state. Likewise, we can hold that Zhuangzi employs various therapeutic techniques, especially those in Chapter 2 that have us doubt whether Shifei distinctions really represent reality, aimed at helping the ordinary person achieve such a state. My only claim to the conventionalism is one aspect of Zhuangzi's larger vision that has gone ignored. Likewise, Zhuangzi's therapeutic techniques not only help us bring into a state of spiritual freedom, they also help us survive death by freeing us from the bound. Yeah, no, that's clear. Further connections. In this section, I will draw out further connections between my conventionalist reading of the Zhuangzi and other parts of the text, for this interpretation could help cast light upon or open up alternative interpretations of other passages, though there are numerous passages that can be incorporated in this way. I'll restrict my discussion to 4. The first 2 passages I'll look at seem to portray the conventionalist idea that by altering one's attitudes, one also alters one's survival conditions. The first of those is found near the end of Chapter 6. Yan Hui said, "I'm improving." Confucius says, "What do you mean by that?" "I've forgotten benevolence and righteousness." "That's good, but you still haven't got it." Another day the two meet again, and Yan Hui said, "I'm improving." "What do you mean by that?" "I can sit down and forget everything." Confucius looked very startled and said, "What do you mean, sit down and forget everything?" Yan Hui said, "I smash up my limbs and body, drive out perception and intellect, cast off form, do away with understanding, make myself identical with the great thoroughfare. This is what I mean by sitting down and forgetting everything." Confucius says, "If you're identical with it, you must have no more likes. If you've been transformed, you must have no more constancy. So really you are a worthy man after all. With your permission, I'd like to become your follower." This seems to indicate that a change in one's attitude can lead to a change in one's identity or survival conditions, and sitting and forgetting, Yan Hui becomes identical with the great thoroughfare, therefore survives the transformation of the world. This metaphysical change is emphasized when Confucius says, "If you've been transformed, you must have no more constancy." I take Confucius here, who is speaking on behalf of Zhuangzi, as holding that the ordinary person is constant because from the beginning to the end of their life they are a human. Yan Hui's existence, on the other hand, is not so confined to the stage where he's a human, and so is inconstant. This is a similar account is found just prior to the stories of Master Yu and Lai. There we have the account of Buliang Yi, who undergoes a gradual multi-week process of learning the way of the sage. After some training, he was able to put the world outside himself. After that, he was able to put life outside himself, and after that, he had done away with the past and the present. He was able to enter where there is no life and no death. Like the Yanu passage above, I take this to be a story portraying Buliang Yi is becoming identical to the great thoroughfare of which all things are a part, and likewise is illustrating sort of conventionalism I've been defending. The story not only describes the alteration of Buliang Yi's attitudes, where the process of putting things outside himself describes the freeing of the bound, but also explains that the change in those attitudes subsequently leads to Buliang Yi's survival of death. For the end of the process, he is able to enter where there is no life and no death. Well, my question is reading, since entering there where there is no life seems to indicate a mysterious state of existence that transcends the state of being alive, and so is describing something quite different from the sort of earthly existence I've been concerned with. See Roth 2000 for this sort of interpretation. Cat's up to something. However, in response, we could instead interpret Sheng not as the state of the living. Don't know where Sheng is. Oh, Sheng. Not as a state of living, but only as one's coming to be. That's where Si is used to indicate the end of one's existence, and Sheng is used to indicate its beginning. The passage tells us that Buling Yi was able to attain a state where his existence has neither end nor beginning, instead existing both through the beginningless past and endless future by means of the ongoing transformation of the great thoroughfare. It might seem strange that one's current attitude can determine when or even if one came into existence in the past. Even if we can alter or affect the future, we tend to think that the past cannot be changed. In response, it's good to keep in mind that the claim is not our... Nope, there goes my power. And thus, my article. I feel bad I sort of scared off Saito Architect by being dismissive of Jesus, perhaps, but anyway, I'm not Christian. What am I supposed to think? He's figured everything out. Even if we can alter or affect the future, we tend to think the past cannot be changed. In response, it's good to keep in mind the claim is not our attitudes can affect the past physical facts, such as the past qualitative facts and facts about the arrangement of mass energy in the past. Rather, the claim is only that the attitudes can affect identity facts, such as whether there's a point in the past when Budding came into existence and where that point lies, if there is such a point. Though most have the forceful intuition that we cannot affect past physical facts, I think there's room to embrace the idea that we can affect past identity facts. In fact, conventionalists tend to embrace such an idea. See, for instance, blah, blah, blah. We talked a bit about this yesterday when I read the Kovacs 2020 article that he's citing, if you're interested. Similarly, I interpret the passage immediately following as that which kills life does not cease to exist, and that which brings life into being does not come to be. I take this to be a description of the great thoroughfare, which neither comes into nor out of existence, but gives life and death to all living things. See Wang or Wang for further evidence that Zhuangzian takes the world to be without beginning or end. Thus, by conventionalist reading Master Lai and Master Yu passages does not require that we also take this passage, that we also read this passage relating to conventionalism in the above way. It does make such a reading attractive. Let us now turn to another passage, return to the story of Master Lai, in which, gasping and wheezing, Master Lai lay at the point of death. His wife and children gathered round him in a circle and began to cry. Master Li, who had come to ask how he was, said, "Shu, get back, don't disturb the process of change." It was quite striking that Master Li not only drives out the grieving family, but does so in such a rude and excessive way. However, if my conventionalist reading is right, there is very good reason for this strange behavior. The grief of Master Lai's wife and his children might influence Master Lai's own attitudes, tempting him to resist or regret his transformation, resulting in a bound attitude. On conventionalism, such a change in attitudes would be detrimental to Master Lai's survival of the process. Master Li's actions are therefore not mere boorishness, but instead an urgent response to the detrimental situation. It's a response that's crucial for preserving Master Lai's survival of his impending death. This further highlights the importance of living in a community with like-minded people who can come to each other's aid in such a way that is one to portray Master Si, Yu, Li, and Lai as becoming friends upon discovering the unity of their attitudes towards death. This is also portrayed in the friendship of Master Sang-Hu, Fan, and Qingzhang. On conventionalism, such community becomes crucial not only for maintaining one's attitudes, but also for the preservation of the survival of one's death. Finally, let me connect my conventionalist reading with a famous butterfly dream that appears at the end of chapter 2. Once Zhuangzian dreamt he was a butterfly flitting and fluttering around, happy with himself and doing as he pleased. He didn't know he was Zhuangzian. Suddenly he woke up and there he was, solid and unmistakable Zhuangzian. But he didn't know if he was Zhuangzian who had dreamed he was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming he was Zhuangzian. Between Zhuangzian and a butterfly there must be some distinction. This is called the transformation of things. This passage is quite familiar because it raises an epistemological issue. He didn't know if he was Zhuangzian who had dreamed he was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming he was Zhuangzian, but draws an ontological confusion. Between Zhuangzian and butterfly there must be some distinction. This is called the transformation of things. On a conventionalist reading, we can connect the epistemological and ontological elements via our psychological attitudes. That is, the epistemological issue is raised as a therapeutic technique for adopting an attitude of being free from bound, and Zhuangzian conventionalism implies such a psychological freedom brings with it our survival of death and hence our transformation into different beings. This reading is similar to what Robert Allenson calls the external transformation interpretation, in which the passage is pointing to an ontological transformation that occur in the world. This Allenson contrasts with, first, the confusion interpretation, on which the text is drawing the skeptical conclusion that we cannot know whether we are awake or dreaming, and second, Allenson's own self-transformation interpretation, which also involves a reordering of the text, in which the story points to one's transformation to a more enlightened state. Against the external transformation interpretation, Allenson raises a number of objections, though I largely agree with the Guillaume's replies to these objections. I think there's more that should be said against Allenson's objection that the interpretation's conclusion is too weak. His objection is as follows. So, since this butterfly thing is like, top 10 most famous philosophical things, let's stick in Hypernolicon. This is a debate. And what, we have three things. The external transformation. Confusion interpretation. Let's call that the skeptical interpretation. His objection, so Allenson objects to the external transformation interpretation by saying we don't need recourse to a dream metaphor to arrive at the awareness that things are constantly changing from one to another. If our only concern is transience, we don't need any sort of awakening to become aware of this transience. We would not first have to go through some puzzle involving the confusion of reality with illusion. We would only have the philosopher's lament of the brevity of existence. We would not mistake what is for what is not. Qualified dream would serve as an opposite metaphor calculated about the constant suggestion of things in the world. My conventionalist reading, however, there's very good reason to appeal to the butterfly dream, since the goal is to help us embrace the idea of surviving in forms wildly different than one's human form. Dreaming that one's a butterfly is strongly conducive toward that end. In the dream, one believes oneself to be a butterfly, and likewise completely forgets one's human form, just as Zhuangzian didn't know he was Zhuangzian. One might object that this doesn't explain why Zhuangzian needs to appeal to a dream state. Why not just have Zhuangzian imagine that he is a butterfly? However, in response, there's a good reason for this, for in a dream rather than a mere imagination. One is completely immersed in the experience and is completely convinced that one's a butterfly. However, we should keep in mind, as Lee reminds us, there are limits to how closely a dream can match the actual experience of a butterfly. The psychological impact and ability to free one from the bound would therefore be much greater than if one were to merely imagine it. But why is the passage mentioned that after awakening Zhuangzi didn't know if he is Zhuangzi who had dreamed he is butterfly or a butterfly dreaming he is Zhuangzi? I take this also to be a therapeutic tool. Waking up from the dream, we might easily forget the mindset that we are therein. However, reflecting on the idea that even now one might be a butterfly, we are powerfully reminded of our psychological state in the dream. Consequently, the dream's potential to bind us is amplified. Allison is surely correct that we do not need to have recourse to a dream metaphor to arrive at the awareness that things are constantly changing from one to another. On my interpretation, however, the goal is not the mere recognition that things change, but instead the alteration of our very survival conditions. Appealing to and reflecting on such dream experiences turns out to be a powerful everyday tool for allowing us to achieve such an end. Furthermore, contrary to Thomas Bing's suggestion that the value of the story can be equally captured if the dream were instead of a human or a Martian, it's crucial that the dream be of a butterfly or some other form radically different from our own. Since the latter sorts of experiences are existing in a radically different way, they have a much greater potential for freeing us from our attachment to our human form and setting us on the path to being free from the bound. Let's put that all in. That's all good stuff. And the reply, I'm just gonna, I think, copy and paste quite a bit. Maybe not. Actually, I might summarize. Yeah, no, I'm gonna summarize, paraphrase. Cool. I have argued for conventionalist reading of the Zhuangzian, on which, by radically changing our attitudes, we can survive our death and persist through the endless transformations of the world. Envisioning master human lives surviving as a rooster or rat's liver, it's tempting to interpret this as a mere flight of imagination or a way of pretending. One might even worry this sort of delusion, but on the conventionalist reading, there's nothing delusional or fictional about it. And adopting an unbound attitude that embraces the endless transformations of the world, one can rationally and wholeheartedly exclaim how marvelous the Creator is. What is it going to make out of you next? Where is it going to send you? Many thanks to Jenny Hung, Ying Zhao, Shinting, and to anonymous reviewers from Dow. Thanks also to Mary Bockover and people at SecPC. It's published in Dow. All right, that is it for this article, and as you can see by my blank PDF reader, that's it for all the conventionalism stuff I want to read. So now I have the paper on conventionalism that I'm reading this for. I might work on that. Even if I am going to read stuff, I don't have time now. I have to feed the dogs in a little while. So that's going to be it for this stream. Thank you, everybody who stopped by. I think total of one person. One person chatted. Maybe other people watched. So goodbye.